Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the fifth in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute Friday morning series that gives faculty, Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know the humanities, arts, interpretive social sciences faculty at Duke. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. And while I regret that we cannot this morning meet over breakfast in Smith Warehouse at Duke, our usual location for TGI FHI, I'm delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs and also an interview with Marty Miller in which he describes his work. This morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Marty Miller, who is professor in the Department of History. Professor Miller's scholarship focuses on the USSR and Russia and has covered topics from anarchism, terrorism, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. In addition to his training in philosophy, European history, and Russian history, he has been a fellow in the psychiatric epidemiology training program at Columbia University's Medical Center and the School of Public Health from 79 to 81. In his 1976 biography of Kropotkin, Professor Miller focuses on turning points in Kropotkin's life and the roots of his radicalism in the 1870s. The biography is influenced by Erik Erikson's on Martin Luther and Mahatma Gandhi in the sense that he analyzes Kropotkin's turn to an ideology that combined the features of European anarchism and Russian populism as marked by the culmination of his search for an adult identity. And in particular, Miller argues that Kropotkin's anarchism represented a depersonalization of rebellion against paternal authority, whereas his populism represented a displacement of filial love. Miller presents Kropotkin then through concepts of the internal psychological meaning that anarchism and populism held for him. And he analyzes too how the mature ideological system that emerged from Kropotkin's work emerged from an effort to construct a philosophical basis to legitimize anarchism. His 1986 monograph, The Russian Revolutionary Emigres, 1825 to 1870, marks a distinction between two generations of emigrants who were critical of the Tsar but not organized, and contrasts them to the more initially synthetic group ideologically, who then nonetheless grew into warring factions. I got to know Professor Miller's work through his 1998 Freud and the Bolsheviks, Psychoanalysis in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. That book was one of the early ones to provide an in-depth historical analysis of psychoanalysis's internationalist scope, but also the particularities of its development in that particular site. Professor Miller situates Russian Freudianism in the history of medicine, showing Freud's enormous impact on Russian medicine, first as an exciting outside influence, and then almost as a powerful taboo. And he shows that late Imperial Russian medicine, in distinction really to music, literature, and the arts, was largely on the receiving end of that cultural interchange, showing how early Soviet Freudians floundered, as he puts it, in an attempt at pleasing two fathers. They contrarily sought approval, both from the International Psychoanalytic Association and from the Bolsheviks. His 2012 book, The Foundations of Modern Terrorism, State Society and the Dynamics of Political Violence, takes the reader from Greco-Roman antiquity to the Cold War, with some brief additional reflections on the post-Cold War era, and is as much about a history of state terror as it is of non-state terror, and thus has to enter into political history, political theory, and questions surrounding the legitimacy of the state. His recent work brings together a variety of strands of previous scholarship, including a 2015 essay, Diagnostics of Violence, Russian Psychiatry in World War I. Today, he's going to be talking to us about photography, and his talk is titled Western Documentary Photography of the Soviet Union, 1928 to 1968. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. And now it's over to you, Marty.
Thank you very, very much, Ranji, for that excellent introduction. It's nice to have an analysis of the career work, which I haven't really put together in such an intelligent manner in quite a while. So thank you for that. And for Sarah also, who's done an enormous job in setting this up for me, and I appreciate that. So I do want to mention, in addition to all the thanks that are due to so many people for setting this up, I want to mention that there's a parallel collection at the Duke Library, which I think is important for those of you who are here today to know about, in case you don't. There's we have a documentary collection of photographs called Americans in the Land of Lenin, documentary photographs of early Soviet Russia. Much of this enormous collection of 750 photographs of life in the Soviet Union starting in 1919 parallels much of my own work. But what's interesting about it is that it is done largely by amateurs as opposed to the professionals that I'll be talking about shortly. But there's a direct connection, and we have a colleague in Kazan who's already well at work and has published an article about the collection. So I did want to mention that first. Now on to my own work, and what I'm going to try and do is to explain to you a little bit about this current book that I've just finished, which is the basis of the material that I'll be showing you and talking about with you. What I've done is put together essentially a history of the Western documentary photographers who, for a variety of reasons, some of which will become clear to you in just a moment, decided to apply for and received actually visas to work in the Soviet Union. And I just want to change the date a little bit because I've done some extra work and added, really it starts with the revolution itself. So the real dates here are 1918 to 1968, technically speaking. But the individual photography starts in 1928, which is that title. The attempt here from a methodological standpoint is to provide visual evidence to add to our current understanding of the culture of the Soviet Union. And these photographers, I think, provide a very rich resource of evidence, and I'll try and convince you of how that's the case as we move through these. So the way that I'll do this is I'll read a paragraph or two about them to just introduce the situation that they found themselves in, and then show you the photographs that I'll be describing, and work my way through that way. So, as somebody once said, in the beginning, there was the National Geographic magazine, because that is, as it turns out, where the first evidence that we have for the images that the Soviet of the Soviet Union that emerged for the Western world. The scope of the National Geographic magazine was enormous at the time. It had a large number of subscribers, not only in the United States, but also in the UK and Europe, and was the major source of visual evidence at the time of the revolution itself and in the immediate aftermath of it. The orientation of the magazine's coverage, as you'll see in a moment, shifted from exaltation after the announcement of the provisional government as the foundation for a democratic republic in February of 1917 to outright horror in the aftermath of the Bolshevik seizure of power later that year in October. That was followed, of course, by the military and diplomatic presence displayed after the October Revolution. I'm assuming, and if you don't know about this, there's plenty of reading to do, that the United States and Britain literally invaded the Soviet Union from both sides, from the East and the West. And some of the coverage that the National Geographic photographers were involved with was sort of following behind the invasion forces to cover the situation. So the photographs in the issues, the earliest issues that we have visual evidence for, October 1917, emphasize the destruction of Kremlin churches, featured scenes of masses of Orthodox believers demonstrating in the streets of Moscow and Petrograd, protesting anti-Bolshevik edicts. With the onset of the Civil War, the National Geographic sent literally squads of photographers to cover the advance of the Allied Expeditionary Force as it moved westward from Vladivostok. Once Lenin's new economic policy had taken root, the magazine shifted back to a more sympathetic approach with photographs of crowded markets in the streets and the tourist sites in the restored capital of Moscow, as well as even covering rural areas that were now presented as welcoming to visitors from the West. Here is a scene, one of a number of them, which, according to the National Geographic captions, was the last massive religious ceremony that was able to take place in Red Square shortly after the Bolsheviks seized power. This would have been November of a year later, in November of 1918. The next image is one that they did not date, but it is, I found it to be an absolutely striking image of the horrors of the Russian front in the First World War. I think the photograph expresses everything that can possibly be said about it. I wish I could, I apologize for the vagueness of some of these images. They're very difficult to capture, but the face of that woman is, if you saw it close up, you would just never forget it as she stands above her fallen husband. Next. These are the last pictures, again, according to the magazine, of, they're called Orthodox mendicants. These are poor, actually one of them is blind, standing beggars outside of the church while it was still functioning. Of course, you can see they're being guarded on the top of the steps. Next is, this is the emergence of the beginnings of the wall posters, which would soon become forms of art, as you'll see in a moment. But at this point, they were propaganda posters, the very first ones that the Bolsheviks were posting on the sides of buildings, and they are artistic, in addition to carrying their message. This is called "Death Stalks the Land." Along the roadsides of Russia, the National Geographic found a number of rather sad, homeless people who had simply been uprooted by the war and the revolution. The caption that the National Geographic photographer included here was a soldier who passed by, looked at this family and said, "What a waste of rations," which says more about the attitude of the captionist than it probably does about the scene. But in any case, that's the way that was posted. Okay, now I want to move from the National Geographic to the first of the actual photographers. In 1927, 2 years later, I'm sorry, read the wrong paragraph, excuse me. In 1925, René Philipp Müller, a writer and journalist from Vienna, spent several months in Moscow researching material for his book, which was in English, translated a year after it was first published in German, called "The Mind and Face of Bolshevism." It's a bibliographic rarity. Fortunately, the Duke Library has one of the few copies left in the world. It was published also in French, and it was translated into other languages later. Though the text reflects a critical interpretation of Soviet politics common in the West during this period, the hundreds of images included are more stunning in historical perspective than they even were in their original context. Rarely has the artistic utopian culture of the communist experiment been expressed so comprehensively in a single study at the moment that it was at its productive height. Some of the photographs included in Philip Miller's book are the sole survivors of artifacts that were later either censored or destroyed. There are examples, and I'll show you some in just a moment, of public statues commemorating the later to be discredited revolutionaries Bakunin and Murat that once stood prominently in Gorky Park, radical stage sets arranged by the director, the very famous director at the time, Vsevolod Meyerhold, that were later demolished, a huge poster celebrating the leadership of Trotsky placed at the entrance of the Astoria Hotel in Leningrad, and a rare picture of Alexandra Kollontai, probably the most famous female Bolshevik in the party at the time, leading a meeting of the women's department, the Zhenadiel in Moscow. Also noticeable is the absence of any public presence of the emerging authority of Stalin in all of these hundreds of photographs. Okay, let me review a few of them with you right now. This is, again, an unusual portrait of Trotsky at the time when he still had a very prominent office in the Kremlin itself. Here is the photograph, and unfortunately, again, I have to apologize for the poor nature of it, but on the left side of the Astoria Hotel, which is now plastered with, at this point, propaganda posters, there is a huge portrait drawing, really, of Trotsky himself. So when you walked in the doorway, which is at the bottom left there of this photograph, you just couldn't help but see the great leader of the moment and his picture. This is, if anybody knows where this was, I'd be delighted to hear, because no one that I've asked has found it. But there was a gigantic rock, a kind of Mount Rushmore in Russia, of Lenin himself. It's since apparently been destroyed, but it was quite a sight at the time. Here's the portrait of Alexandra Kollontai, who's right in the center there, facing the camera at a meeting of the Women's Division of the party in 1926. This is an art studio. It was a period of time in the middle 20s, and Philip Miller writes a good bit about this, where new models were actually presented to young art students, and this is an example of one of them. One of the other things that the Bolsheviks did at this point was to take what had been imperial dishware from the Winter Palace and elsewhere, also from people's homes who had been sequestered, and reshape them into artistic designs celebrating Bolshevik messages. This is about the united force of the power of the peasantry and the working class. They're actually quite colorful if you saw them in color. This is an example of one of the many, many stage designs set by Meyerhold's theater. Very radical sets. A lot's been written about his theater designs. All of these sets, and including the next one, have been destroyed. There's the only evidence we have of them are these photographs. This is the other one. And you can see the enormity of the size because of the figure on the stage below, who's so small. This is the statue of Bakunin that's never been recovered. It was probably smashed to bits at some point, but it shows him enwrapped by what was interpreted as the forces of capitalism and imperialism that he's struggling to emerge from. The other thing the Bolsheviks did, which Philip Miller recorded in many photographs, were they were called propaganda trains. These were sent out from Moscow and Petrograd, later Leningrad, of course, into the countryside with a variety of messages proclaiming the success of the revolution on the outside. And often what they carried inside were films of the Russian Civil War with the victory of the Red Army that were shown in villages across the country. And I think this is the last Philip Miller photograph that I have for you, which he was quite captivated and went back to the scene a number of times. He had an interpreter with him who asked these women what they were doing, and what he was told, and this is what he records in his book, is that they were taking bark from the trees from the villages where they came from, and they were placing the bark in the icy water, and they dug the hole themselves, which was supposed to, if the bark floated in the water rather than sank, it was believed that they would have a good harvest in the spring. Okay, now we move on to the next photographer, and this is where the actual study of the individuals really starts for the professional photographers that I've examined. 2 years later, in 1927, an American photographer, James Abe, while working in Berlin on an article about industrialization, requested a visa from Moscow to photograph economic progress under the new economic policy. This is the way he stated it. Abe's real intention, however, was to become the first Western photographer to get a picture of Stalin in his Kremlin office. Abe, who was now largely forgotten, had been one of Hollywood's premier photographers. He was also, at this point, a severe critic of communism, combining his skills of knowing how to sneak backstage to catch performers in relaxed moments together with his combined with his private anti-communist crusade for the freedom of information, as he called it. Abe simply went where he wasn't supposed to go. Although he considered his greatest success in getting Stalin to permit him to take posed pictures in the Kremlin, of which this is one, the first by anyone from the West, his most impressive photograph was actually taken at the funeral for Nadezhda Alliluleva, Stalin's second wife, who had committed suicide. That was in 1932. In his telling, the way that he got this photography, which I'll show you in just a moment, he wormed his way into the National Hotel across from the Kremlin and, this is his description, escaping the view of armed guards on the street, he hung his camera out of the window to capture the only known images of the funeral procession. He claims that the guns were being raised by the soldiers who saw him just as he jumped back in and shut down. He's very dramatic in his descriptions. So now let's look at a few of his photographs. This is the one that Stalin most liked. This is the, I just have two examples to show you of the funeral of Alliluleva. There's no evidence that any photographs in the world have ever existed of this moment, except the ones that James Abe was able to take. Again, it's dark and very difficult to see with clarity here, but this is the huge funeral procession as it's emerging onto Red Square. And there's one more, I think, after. Yes, this is the other one, which is the procession that as it's moving out of the area where the funeral had taken place to the burial site. At this point, Abe jumps back inside, according to his description, and wasn't able to take any further pictures. He also was skilled at, as I said before, of going to places and shooting pictures that he wasn't supposed to be, where he wasn't supposed to be, and about subjects that he wasn't supposed to be. How he got, there's a whole long story, which I won't bore you with. He actually snuck his rolls of film out in the trousers of his children who visited him in order to get the film back to the United States. This is one example of, and he wrote this on the photograph himself, the forbidden, of a market after the closing of the market, where the peasants were waiting for a train or carts to take them back to their villages, which was condemned by the police. I think there's a slide next of the newspaper article from, no, I guess I didn't include that, sorry. That was a picture that appeared in the newspapers in England and the United States at the time. This is the last Abe photograph, and I wish it could, we can't blow it up, can we? I guess not. I'll describe it to you. You'll be able to see this. What Abe did here was he took a photograph of the ruins of a church after the Bolsheviks had literally destroyed it. What he does here, which is amazing, and you have to look carefully, at the bottom center of the screen, there's a hand emerging out of the ground, almost a pliant cry for help from someone who's been buried in the rubble. This was very evocative for Abe and really symbolic for him of the crushing nature of communism itself. Okay, now on to the next photographer, Margaret Bourke-White. In 1931, she was an aspiring documentary photographer and published her book called Eyes on Russia, which documented pictorially her visits to the Soviet Union as a staff photographer for Henry Luce's newly created Fortune magazine. Her book on the Soviet Union, together with her articles in other magazines and newspapers, were widely read and provided sympathetic images of life under communism that countered the prevailing antipathy toward Russia. Most of her pictures reflected expressions of the industrial projects central to the Stalin 5-year plan. Commentators have frequently referenced what has been called her love affair with the Russian machine age in response to the prominence that she gave to these projects in her work. She also received permission to visit the Georgian Republic, where she traveled to see the birthplace of Stalin. And while there, she actually located, and I'll show you in a moment, these pictures, photographs of both his mother and his aunt. Now, to begin, well, I'll read this after I show you a few more pictures. This strange item I'm including simply because of its oddity. Margaret Bourke-White at this point had an office on the 32nd floor of the Chrysler building. And there was an outdoor patio looking out, of course, onto the rest of Manhattan. In 1932, Sergei Eisenstein, the great Soviet film director, was on his way out to Hollywood and passed by Bourke-White's office and asked her if she knew where he could get him a shave. And she said, "Step into my office." And so she had her personal barber take care of the job and photographed him. So I thought that was kind of an interesting moment that is less well known in Eisenstein's career, certainly. This is an example, and there are tons of them. I mean, literally hundreds of photographs of the machinery of the 5-year plan that Bourke-White photographed. I'm going to show you another side of the world that she was interested in, but these are the ones she's best known for and were most famous. These are the ones that were published in magazines over and over again. Here's another one, which I think shows more grime than somehow any kind of celebration of the 5-year plan. It's a mine stoker who's, again, full of black grease. He's literally dripping with it, which is maybe hard to see here in the midst of a factory. This is now the two pictures that she took. This is Stalin's aunt, and the one following that's his mother. There's a little bit of description that she included in her book about this one. When she got there, of course, Stalin's mother refused to have her picture taken. No one had done this before. No one had even visited. So she was, and then she said, "Well, okay, but let me get dressed first." So she goes back into her apartment and comes back out again looking like this. Margaret Bourke-White asked her if she could smile. She said she would not. And so she took the picture. The only other item perhaps worth mentioning is that Margaret Bourke-White asked her if she knew about her husband's work, and she said she had no idea what her husband's job was. So there you have that. Okay, the next one, this one again it's a pity that you can't see it all blown up because it's an extraordinarily the original is actually at the University of Michigan archive, which is where I got the copy. It's a picture of a children's hospital, and she simply passed by the waiting room and snapped this picture. Here, I'm just looking for the description. I have it. Bourke-White found a group of parents and children waiting to be seen by the doctors. It is difficult to describe the expressions of deep concern that she caught in their faces. Though they clearly knew they were being photographed by a foreign visitor, no one even attempted to smile for the camera. The situation was simply too grave. Their collective gaze of anxiety remains fixed, impenetrable, and overwhelming. Two of the children are bandaged. You can't really see it very well. There are actually wires dangling on all sides of them, which is not very clear either. But of course, the great star and portrait of Lenin remain powerful images behind them. Now, this one I want to say a word about also, because it's a very unusual Margaret Bourke-White photograph. She caught this particular worker. She actually went to a factory site in the dead of winter. And this is a worker in a Siberian locality who's pictured sitting alone during his lunch break, eating inside a makeshift canteen, fully dressed in his black coat and shapka, his Russian hat, with icicles, which I don't think you'll be able to see, clinging to his beard in the unheated surroundings. There are propaganda posters which are almost in defiance of the situation that he's experiencing, portraying the great successes of the work done by workers to bring the 5-year plan to completion. It's a stunning picture. Now, I just added these because Margaret Bourke-White went back again to the Soviet Union in 1941, just as the war was starting. And it turns out that she ended up being the only Western photographer in the city of Moscow at the time that the Germans began bombing. She was trapped there and couldn't even get out for quite a while. One of the pictures that she took just before the bombing started was the sandbag bookstalls that you see here, where people are still insisting on going out to read before the air raid sirens sound. Now, this picture is one of a number of photographs that she took against the advice of everyone who spoke to her. The American embassy was at Spaso House at the time. She went up onto the roof of the embassy in the middle of the night during the bombardment by the German bombers and took a number of photographs, of which I thought this was one of the most illustrative. It almost looks like a ballet of light, of imagery. And if you didn't know that these were tracers from bombs, you probably would guess that it was something much more aesthetic. You can see the icicles dripping from a lamppost on the right that contrasts with the imagery from the tracer bombs. And the final one in her collection that I've included here is a scene when she finally was able to leave during that 1941 visit. On her way out, she was taken to a village that had just been destroyed by the Germans. And these are Russians, a Russian family, a mother and a child, who are lying dead. It's a horrible picture. And there are a number of them that she took just as she was whisked out of the country. Okay, now we return back to the past, to the chronology where we were. The same year that Bourke-White's book was published, the German collage artist, John Hartfield, was invited to Moscow to share his expertise and to further his own interest in the work of colleagues like Gustav Klutzes, Alexander Rodchenko, and Max Alpert. These were very prominent photographers and artists at the time in Moscow. He remained a full year, and as a member of the German Communist Party, was able to immerse himself as a respected comrade inside the Soviet cultural scene in ways that all other Western visitors could not. He was able to travel widely inside the country, which he did. He gave lectures and taught workshops at schools and especially at working class factories. He was also invited to join the editorial collective on an issue of one of the most prominent journals at the time, SSSR Nastroika, the USSR in construction. The journal specialized in documentary photography. Now, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, I found the image that you're looking at now. One of the most striking images from Hartfield's stay in the Soviet Union is that of an African woman portrayed in a dress covered with swastikas. To contextualize this photo collage, Hartfield's career had been characterized by anti-fascist portraits viciously satirizing the Nazi leadership, including Hitler himself, most of which were published frequently in the left-wing Berlin magazine Allgemeine Illustrierte Zeitung. For this collage, Hartfield collaborated with Varvara Stepanova, the prominent Moscow artist and partner of Rodchenko. So the two of them are listed in the back of this artwork. The dominant influence here was nevertheless Hartfield, as evidenced by the centrality of the menace of German fascism, which was a still less visible presence among Soviet photographers at this time. The other significant Moscow-produced Hartfield picture from 1931 was his final collage before returning to Europe. He rather brilliantly combined two separate images into one to create a collage that was, however unintended, an introduction to the new wave of socialist realism about to crest. The picture he used as a backdrop for his collage was an aerial shot of a recently constructed Moscow neighborhood. He drafted onto it a horizontally redesigned photograph of a looming statue of Lenin, arm outstretched, darkly covering the landscape picture of the city area, as though a communist cloud of the regime's founder had encircled the entire urban scene. It's quite a stunning picture when you see it all blown up. Okay, now, this is now moving on to the next photographer. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about any of these individual photographers later on. In 1947, John Steinbeck, supported by the New York Herald Tribune, received a visa to travel to the Soviet Union. He invited the prominent Hungarian war photographer Robert Capa to accompany him in order to provide a report on the post-war USSR with both words and pictures. They spent 40 days traveling to and from Moscow together with a student translator and the necessary KGB advisor. The result was a book called Russian Journal, which included several dozen of the hundreds of photographs that Capa shot. All of those photographs and the contact sheets and prints are in the Capa archive at the International Center for Photography in New York, which I was able to examine. The most surprising part of their stay in the Soviet Union was their trip to Stalingrad, which allowed Capa to become the first Western photographer authorized to take post-war pictures of the city, still ravaged from the fierce battles against the German invading forces. He caught not only the empty shells, I'll show you these in just a moment, the empty shells of former buildings reduced to rubble, but also the denizens of the city, many of whom seemed to be staggering around the ruins, dazed and confused. In one picture, two children sit near a road where vehicles carried military equipment away, playing with toy vehicles of the very war itself. In another, a photographer sets up a makeshift studio. I'll show you these in just a moment. Okay, let me go back and look at the pictures with you. So this one, there's a theme in some of these documentary photographers, and Capa's work is one of them. He always found an outsider. He always found someone who is not part of the central focus. And that here's a picture of an outing that's taking place in Gorky Park in Moscow with a family transfixed by an exhibit of some sort or other. But what Capa was concerned about was the guy who's walking off to the right, who just leaves the scene. It doesn't matter how we interpret it or understand that. The point is that it's a leitmotif, as you'll see in his pictures. Here, this is inside GUM, the fantastic department store in Moscow. And you have to look carefully, but the only person, what Capa did was he went up the staircase to the second floor of the store and shot this picture of the crowd assembling below, shopping, buying, and so on. The man in the very center of the picture is the KGB agent who was watching him. And he's the only person who's not shopping because he's looking directly up at Capa, which was his job, of course, was to cover him. Capa also was invited to a fashion show, which he was quite fascinated about. Steinbeck has some description of this in his book. This is just one of their several photographs that he was able to take. What's interesting here is how few women, as you will notice, are among the reviewers of this latest fashion. Stalin, of course, is watching everything from above. All right, so these are some of the scenes, and I've only got a very few to show you, but there are literally dozens and dozens of them. This is simply a street scene of a destroyed area of Moscow, where people are beginning to repopulate. This is a bus stop, believe it or not, and that's all these people are doing, is waiting for a bus to come. But the carnage is obvious. Now, here again is Kappa's isolated figure. He was taken to a collective farm, he and Steinbeck both, and I think I have another picture of that later. But what fascinated Kappa here was the fact that the officer who was responsible for tending to them goes off, sits on a fence, and picks up a book and starts reading it. And Kappa found that amazing. That's right. The next one is another example of his. There's always somebody off to the center. The picture really is about these two women who are on their way to work. But what Kappa captures here, he found a Jewish scholar who was sitting reading one of his sacred books outside in rather an uncomfortable position. The women eventually walk right past him. No one says a word to each other. This is another view this is the ruin of an entire neighborhood that was bombed by and destroyed during the German advance in the battle that took place in Moscow. It's hard to see again, but in the very center of this picture, in the middle of this vast field, that's right there, there's an individual who's just scavenging, grabbing whatever's left. This is a very sad picture that Steinbeck describes that Kappa took of a war memorial and what is being pictured here, because Steinbeck was allowed to interview briefly the woman, her husband is buried right at that site, and this is a war memorial with his name on it, and she takes her son, who's standing very close to the gravesite itself, to see him. This is the example of the makeshift photographic studio that was set up. There's a sheet, it's actually a white sheet, I don't know how it came out black in this photograph, that's put up on the wall so that the photographer could take pictures of the soldiers and whoever else wanted to be photographed, and sent the pictures back to their families. And it would look, of course, just like a normal scene. But what Kappa managed to do was to snap the picture in a way that captures the public square in the background, and you can see the whole scene of where the photographer is just inventing this studio outdoors. They were also, because Kappa was a sports freak, it turns out, invited to a Georgian wrestling match. What Kappa was fascinated by, as always, were not the center of the picture of the wrestlers themselves, but rather he asked Steinbeck to write about the fact, and Steinbeck did, that the people who were watching were hanging from trees there beyond the fence because they couldn't get into the area itself. This is one of the many street scenes that Kappa snapped from his hotel room when the KGB guard wasn't watching. And his point was that this is total chaos. People are just wandering all over the place. It does show you how absent traffic was at the time. Very few private cars existed. Most of the vehicles were owned by the state or were public buses. Now, this is a photograph that requires a little bit of description. The one Kappa photograph that continues to generate discussion was taken on the fly. Kappa and Steinbeck were on their way to the Kremlin for an interview. They passed by a large outdoor area that had been turned into a dance space as part of the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the founding of Moscow. As they passed by, Kappa snapped his shutter, inadvertently capturing a national problem that the festivities could not hide, namely that the dancing partners were all women because the men were absent. They were war casualties. And it's very sad. By contrast, he included in the collection a dance scene that was the opposite, full of excitement and spontaneity that he took at the collective farm that they had visited. On to the next. The first Western photographer granted permission to work in Moscow after the death of Stalin, and the first since Kappa's visit was the eminent Henri Cartier-Bresson. 2 books on his trips to Russia in 1954 and 1972 were published, and there are thousands, literally, of unpublished prints, negatives, and contact sheets archived in the Fondation Cartier-Bresson in Paris, where I got the pictures that I'm showing you. He established a friendship with Ilya Ehrenburg, and there's a photograph of his apartment, and corresponded with the Soviet ambassador to France, where he frequently expressed his involvement with Soviet culture. There are so many exemplary images from his visits, but most of them are his ability to find what has been called the decisive moment, which is a translation of a French term that actually doesn't really mean that, but it gets the point across better. In one widely republished picture, Cartier-Bresson caught a group of workers in the Hotel Metropole on a lunch break, where they broke into a period of spontaneous dancing. I'll show you in just a moment. Okay, let's look at the pictures. It'll make more sense. This picture actually is an attempt for Cartier-Bresson to capture. It's the what was the Ukraina Hotel in the background, one of the wedding cake Stalin buildings. Alongside, on the left, the last of the old Moscow that was being destroyed, and on the right, the new Moscow apartment buildings. And we have these figures walking in the very center of the picture, almost as though they're walking from one era into another. This is a picture he liked, that he took outside the Kievsky Vokzal, the train station of a very fashionable, he considered her to be a specimen of bourgeois culture amidst the peasants who were selling flowers that they brought from their villages in the midst of this huge traffic scene and crowded pavement. It's a much better picture when you see the whole thing blown up, double spaced. So here, okay, this is worth a bit of comment. Perhaps the best known of his Soviet photos appeared on the cover of Life magazine, which showed 2 soldiers strolling near 2 women waiting near at a tram stop. Though Life captioned that this showed that members of the Soviet military had been found leeringly gazing at their female prey, Cartier-Bresson denied the entire interpretation. This picture has been republished over and over again. You can judge for yourself. It's hard to see the faces unless you're closer up, I guess, of the 2 soldiers, but they have their eye on these 2 women. There's no doubt about that. I don't know what matters, what thoughts are in their mind. And then, yes, then there's the image where this, the way that Cartier-Bresson understood this was that the female plant advisor, she's the boss, is dressing down her muscle-bound worker who's holding a bunch of, they're not weapons, of course, they're his tools, but he just thought this was a picture that would be very unusual to happen in the Western world. This is a picture that probably also he found to be a very Soviet picture, and something that would not, this was the group of workers in the Hotel Metropole on a lunch break, where they broke into what he calls a spontaneous period of dancing. One of the workers always brought his accordion along anyway, and so they apparently did this not just for him, but quite frequently to entertain themselves. It's a very dynamic picture. Again, it's much more powerful when you see the whole thing blown up in its original size. And of course, the Moscow subway, which dazzled not only foreign visitors, but Muscovites as well. 2 soldiers holding hands. He liked that one too. And this is a Georgian military officer at the opening of the agricultural exhibition in 1954. Oh yeah, this is cute. He just liked this one because of the contrast it shows between the family sitting, entertaining their young charge, who they obviously brought to the zoo. And one of the exhibits, of course, is almost like this ape is leaping out behind them. The woman on the right looks at the ape, which is, of course, a cardboard cutout, with a sense of almost worry on her face and anxiety. this is a typical Cartier-Bresson, where he captures this gigantic cutout of Lenin in front of this is the walkway out of the Winter Palace in what was then Leningrad, with the banners behind him. The thing that fascinated him was that the father and the young child that he's walking with are in lockstep with Lenin. Their feet are exactly in the same positions. Here's a sunbather enjoying himself. This is well, says it all. What you can't catch immediately, but have to be told probably, is the concern of the mother who is looking for her daughter. You can just see her face with concern at the top left there. Right, thank you. This he also found to be a totally Russian picture that could never happen in the Western world. Speaks for itself. They're both reading the same issue of Pravda, by the way. And finally, he found when he traveled to Suzdal, he found these women washing their clothes in the icy waters, and was quite taken with that. Okay, now, between 1959 and 1961, William Klein, an American photographer who has resided in Paris for most of his life, he's actually still with us, visited the Soviet Union several times. Klein is one of the preeminent, they're known as street photographers, who brought his grainy, darkly textured style to Moscow with fascinating results. In his book, simply titled Moscow, Klein showed the results of his wandering the streets of the city to find the moments, scenes, and people he was searching for. Let me just show you. Now, this is an example of one where, again, it's a little hard to see, but the scene is of a mannequin leaning to her right, as though she were overhearing the conversation of the two people on the street at the extreme left part of the photograph. They're all deliberately grainy in black and white. That's his style. Here is a picture that he understood to be a possibility. Either these kids were warming up their motorcycle for a trip somewhere, or they were stealing it, which is what he thought was really happening. The movie behind is called Gloomy Morning, which he found appropriate. This is a photograph of one of the famous, now decorated and retired Soviet actresses, Turchaninova, who was at one of her last public meetings. She went to give a talk, and he captured her as she leaves the hall, entering her car. I'm not sure you can see that, but her fans are reflected in the glass of the doorway right there. That's right. Again, when it's all blown up, large, all this is much more visible. This picture is very hard for you to capture also without seeing it properly, but this is a scene of a sled that is in midair. The woman who's the mother of, and there's a child behind her, a young son, who she's literally pushing off the sleigh as she glides in the air above him. But Klein wasn't even interested in that. What fascinated him was that this was a street scene, and that there was a moving truck on the right. You can just see the little bit of it on the right-hand side of the screen. And there's a guy carrying about a dozen chairs, again, very hard to see here, who's walking away from this particular scene. The whole contrast of the discordancy of it was what captured Klein's camera at that point. Here we have a picture where it's the entrance to Gorky Park at the time in 1959, and the way that he understood this, that there were layers of comprehension. One was the layer at the top of the exhortatory banners and the statue of the imitation of Lenin. The second level was of the people who were seated there, and if you could see them better than you can, they have no relationship to one another. They're just all sitting there, either waiting or have nothing else to do or relaxing. And the third is the young child who is fascinated by Klein's camera and is running up to talk to him. He really liked this photograph, and it's been republished over and over again. It's actually 3 generations of a family. He interviewed them afterwards. The young lady in the front couldn't wait to show off her new bikini to Klein. Behind her is her grandfather, who's taking a snooze. And behind her, all the way in the back, is the young woman's mother, who's actually getting dressed and later got very angry that she posed in front of an American photographer like this. Shameless. Okay, now this, I'm watching the time because I want to bring this to an end so you all have time for questions. Inga Morat was perhaps the documentary photographer from the West most involved with Russia. She refused ever to use the term Soviet Union. She constantly referred to calling the country Russia. She was born in Austria, educated in Germany during the Second World War, where her parents had moved, and ultimately became the first woman to join the exclusive Magnum photographic collective agency founded by Kappa and Cartier-Bresson. She claims to have been attracted to Russian literature since her childhood, but only managed to travel to Moscow after her marriage to the preeminent American playwright Arthur Miller in 1965. She returned many times over the ensuing decades, renewing the friendships that she had made over the years. Through her Western photographic lens, Russia was the intelligentsia. Some of her most enduring images are portraits that she made of the cultural figures whom she believed represented the morality and conscience of the country because of what they wrote, sung, painted, and acted in ways that officially challenged the censorship of the country. The list is long, and I'm not going to read off many of these names that may not be familiar to you, but I do want to show you a couple of pictures. This is a picture actually of which she found amusing because it's Gorky with two people had thrown direct hits at his eyes with snowballs. The cultural commissar at the time was Yelena Furtsova, and this is a picture of her, which was unflattering when was published in Murat's book, that she is convinced that this is the reason that Murat's book was never translated and published inside the Soviet Union until the end of the regime itself. Whether that's true or not, whether Furtsova's influence was so huge, we don't know. This is an example of the many, many pictures of the Soviet intelligentsia. This is Vozdesensky and his wife sitting with Arthur Miller in a special rehearsal room at the Bolshoi Ballet. They were privileged, of course, to use because of Miller's prominence. This is, again, it's a pity you can't see the detail here, but this is an extraordinarily lavish apartment of an aristocratic family. The writer Lev Kassil, who was a very famous children's writer. Another thing that these photographs show is how many gifted Soviet scientists and artists have just been forgotten about, but were very prominent and properly celebrated inside the country at the time. In any case, this is a picture that the woman who's sitting at the left, who's rather elderly, her portrait, she was a former ballet dancer and did some films herself, is right above her as a youth when she was much more beautiful, of course. This is Ilya Ehrenburg's apartment. Very few Westerners were privileged to sit at the table with the great writer. Miller is admiring, and this is Murat's description of it, Arthur Miller is admiring the original Picassos. You can see two of them, one to Miller's left and the other behind Ehrenburg himself. So yeah, I mean, and they had vivid discussions. He visited the apartment a number of times. Okay, this is the very last. I'll be very quick because I want to make sure that Marc Ribot gets a little attention here. He went, he did a number of visits. The ones I want to show you, just a very few pictures of, were done in these years, 60 and 61. He didn't publish a separate book, and so I had to kind of dig around to find all of the images that he did, but they couldn't easily be put together. So this is a shot of the International Chess Competition in 1960 in Gorky Park, which of course is covered with snow, where a number of enthusiasts are anxiously awaiting the news of the next move. while absorbed with either a miniature chessboard or simply reading a book to pass the time. What Ribot was interested in also was the fact that there was a child playing in the back who kind of disrupts the utter seriousness of the scene. There was a kid who actually ran back and forth between the auditorium where the chess championship match was taking place and these frigid visitors who were watching from the outside to let them know that they should move their chessboard accordingly. There are a number of pictures that Ribot took that few others were actually able to get away with, which expressed the anger of Western photography. When you took out a camera, you often got a reaction like this. This is in front of Lenin's tomb. Ribot was almost at the front of the line when this guy turns around, and you can almost hear what he's probably about to say. This is the brigade at Red Square, speaks for itself. And I think there is, yes, this is the last one, which is interesting because it's, if you know anything about Walker Evans' New York photographs that he took secretly in the 1940s, this is a version, Ribot actually was well aware of Walker Evans' work. So he furtively as he could, tried to take pictures of the people who he was on this particular subway train with, and he was fascinated with the expressions of these two. The son is staring with some concern at this clearly Western person sitting across the aisle who's taking a picture, and his father's reading a book with a Pravda newspaper cover around it, which was very, very typical at the time. I had a number of my friends had experiences very similar. They would hand me presents with a book that looked like it was written by some prominent Soviet writer, but it turned out to be a revolutionary treatise of some sort or other covered with Pravda, so no one would know. Okay, last thing I want to say, just by way of conclusion, is that the attempt here that I've made, and of course this is only a part of the whole book, is to try and find aspects of Soviet culture and ordinary life that were often overlooked or simply not interested in by most of the attention that we've gotten in the literature. Now, of course, a lot's missing here. There's nothing about collectivization, nothing about the purge trials, nothing about the camps. We know all of this, though. What these photographers, I hope, offer is a corroborating base of evidence to the written historical record. In some instances, their pictures permit us to witness moments and people in fascinating ways that words cannot even convey. In others, especially in Philip Miller's book, the images reveal artifacts and historical evidence that is simply unavailable because it's all been destroyed. Susan Sontag, in her influential book on photography, has written that the camera does indeed capture reality, not just interpret it, but she was well aware of the capacity of the image to create what she called a substitute world, in which the camera imprisons a past which we believe we can possess, unlike the elusive and constantly changing present. These gifted photographers that I've assembled here, who sought to comprehend the aspects of Soviet reality within their purview, were both subjectivizing and objectivizing as they negotiated between the poles of spectacle and surveillance. Thank you so much for listening and watching.